I'll first say what I think has been effective on the West side, and then I'll discuss the Russian
Sure.
side, where although Russia institutes its own sanctions policy, I mean, the Russian sanctions are often very silly. Morgan Freeman, the movie star, is banned from going to Russia, probably because he did one ad criticizing Putin's role in the 2016 election many times ago. But it doesn't matter whether Morgan Freeman can go to Russia or not, nor does it matter whether, a certain Western official can have bank accounts there, because they don't, whereas almost every Russian
Right.
official or someone connected to them has had them in the West. So, in terms of the West, sanctions would have been most effective in this state capacity question that we're talking about are really the central bank sanctions. And then the sort of sanctions that follow around that, usually this primarily seen as the SWIFT measures targeting Russia's banks. And the reason why this has been so effective is not only did it freeze some 300 billion of Russia's foreign currency reserves at the beginning of the war that were held in the international system in Western countries. But the simplest way to understand it is the impact that it's had is that as soon as a dollar or a euro or a British pound or even a Swiss franc crosses the frontier with Russia, whether that's digital or physical, that dollar, euro, Swiss franc, pound is worth less than any other dollar, euro, Swiss franc, or pound anywhere else in the world,
Right.
because of the sort of costs imposed with getting around those sanctions. Now, the West strategy is to try to have that be as close to a 99-cent discount, say, as possible. Russia's strategy of countering the sanctions is really aimed at trying to keep that discount, as close to zero as possible. And so we've seen a lot of moves one way or the other that have affected this. But overall, the Russian state has to dedicate tremendous resources and capabilities to try to get around that. And even then, simply because of the US dollar's dominance, and in particular, although those sanctions are enforced by many other countries that are not the United States, because of the extraterritoriality of US sanctions and its ability to issue secondary sanctions threats, that really is something that will remain a challenge for the Russian state, no matter what happens in Ukraine going forward, and even caused Russia to fall into default, within just a few months of the start of the war, which is something that will have real costs for Russia, even if it were to sue for peace for years and years to come afterwards. On Russia's side, really the sort of most effective tool, in my view, has been, what I sometimes dub the inflation weapon, which is really a combination of Putin's threats on the gas markets, Putin's actions there. Russia had stopped delivering a large majority of its gas to Europe on normal terms, even before the Nord Stream explosions, which we can certainly discuss later. And also had taken action to threaten global grain supply through its actions in Ukraine, and the initial threat to blockade its ports that was ultimately, at least temporarily, alleviated under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but which we now see Russia talk about bringing back that threat as well. And I think that it has to be understood that when Putin launched his war at the end of February last year, the Russian state had already spent 6 months throttling, turning on and off various gas supplies to Europe, helping to drive up pressures there. And he took those actions at a time where the West was already, and really the whole world, that was already coming out of COVID restrictions at the end of 2021, except for China, was experiencing big inflationary pressures as a result of that. And that made the timing for Putin in taking these economic actions together with his kinetic military actions in Ukraine able to cause particular pain points for the West. And Putin gave a speech last October where he talked a lot about sort of these inflation issues and essentially blamed the West for them and its actions against Russia for stimulating them. He, said it's not Russia's fault, but
Right.
to me, the sort of subtext was very clear that this was a correlation between the West response and the inflationary pressures. How effective that's been, I think, has been in terms of at least shifting the politics and opening up new loopholes and ways to weaken the sanctions regime, which is something that Putin was very effective at doing in Europe after 2014. I think that has been surprisingly ineffective, even if the effect on the global economy has been very large, but that is still a threat that the Russian state continues to use. It has other ways of using the pressure point, including potentially in oil markets going forward. So I don't think that, that the initial battle may have been, the initial attack by the Russian state with those tools may have been blunted, but I don't think that aspect of the war is entirely over yet. And while it didn't play a big role, say, in the US's midterm elections recently or in a number of European elections, those opportunities are still very much going to be there for the Kremlin to press those pressure points when it sees it as being most beneficial to it to do so.